In the late 1970s, Fall River, Massachusetts was a city in free fall. For decades, it had thrived on a booming textile industry, but it rapidly decayed after companies moved their operations overseas. Empty factories loomed like skeletons, and the streets were thick with despair. Yet beneath the surface, something far darker was festering. Whispers circulated about rituals held in the underbelly of the city. A cult gathered within the Harbor Terrace housing projects, and others spoke of their gatherings deep in the Freetown State Forest, where animal carcasses were found drained of blood or arranged in bizarre patterns. Rumors spread that the city's pimps and sex workers weren't just dabbling in the occult, they were consumed by it. Some claimed that they made human sacrifices to the devil himself. It began with a discovery no one could explain. The body of a young woman was found beneath the bleachers of a local high school, her hands tied with fishing line. She bore signs of ritualistic sexual torture. Her face and head had been crushed by repeated blows from a blunt object. Police released a composite drawing to local newspapers, which eventually led to her identification as Doreen Levesque. Just a few months later, another victim was discovered by a man walking his dogs in the wooded outskirts of Fall River. The victim was identified as Barbara Raposa, who had vanished just weeks after Levesque was found, and her face had been crushed with chunks of concrete left at the crime scene. The murder of Barbara Raposa bore an unsettling resemblance to that of Doreen Levesque. Brutal, calculated, and ritualistic. Whispers of a connection began to ripple through the streets, and the city spiraled into paranoia. These weren't random killings. Something darker was unfolding beneath the surface, something beyond comprehension. What truly happened in Fall River defies understanding, and the stories of sacrifice and satanic worship were only the beginning. This is a story of desperation, darkness, and descent. What began as a string of brutal murders unraveled into something far larger, and despite the arrests that would follow, some believed the true horrors were never fully unearthed. There are those who say the cult's influence extended beyond Fall River, stretching into nearby towns like New Bedford, where more women, many of them street workers, vulnerable and alone, vanished without a trace. In places like these, the darkness doesn't just hide in the shadows. It becomes part of the landscape, woven into the lives of those forced into the streets, and those who come too close to the truth rarely live long enough to tell it. You know, when you research something as dark as the Fall River murders, you start to realize how much history is shaped by fear, trauma, and sometimes our inability to process the past. It's a reminder that for a lot of us, confronting difficult emotions isn't just about solving a mystery, it's about understanding ourselves. That's why I'm grateful to have BetterHelp as a sponsor for today's video. Feeling stuck, overwhelmed, or weighed down by things you can't quite make sense of? Therapy helps untangle those feelings. Whether it's dealing with loss, processing the past, or just finding a way forward. BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, making it easy to connect with a licensed therapist from the comfort of your own space. Just fill out a quick questionnaire, get matched with a professional in as little as 48 hours, and if that's not the right fit, you can switch anytime at no extra cost. Start fresh today with my sponsor, BetterHelp. Click the link in the description, betterhelp.com/pandocs, to get 10% off your first month. It was the early morning of October 13th, 1979. 2 women were jogging at the outdoor track of Diman Regional Vocational Technical High School when they discovered a lifeless body beneath the steel bleachers. They contacted the authorities, and the Fall River Police Department assigned Detective Paul Carey with 2 assisting detectives, Alan Sylvia and Tom Joachim. The Massachusetts State Police Department assigned veteran detective Paul Fitzgerald to the case. The crime scene beneath the bleachers was particularly graphic. The body was petite, weighing less than 90 pounds and measuring barely 5 foot. She had been entirely undressed except for her blouse. Her wrists and ankles were bound by twine and fishing line, suggesting a possible sexual motive to the crime. Her skull had been crushed by multiple blows from a blunt object, likely just hours before she had been discovered. Police recovered rocks from the scene, covered with her blood. She had likely been stoned to death. The medical examiner determined that she had not been sexually assaulted. It was determined that she had suffered multiple skull fractures, and the examination also revealed stab wounds to the back of her head. The medical examiner suggested that this was a ritualistic murder with likely more than one person being involved. The evidence pointed to sexual torture, details of which will be deliberately omitted here. The Fall River Police Department released a composite picture of the victim to newspapers, hoping to establish a positive identification. However, the details of the crime were not included, likely hoping to obscure the ritualistic nature of the crime from the public. Tragically, the victim's father recognized her from a composite and description in the Sunday edition of the New Bedford Standard Times newspaper. The victim was Doreen Levesque, a 17-year-old from New Bedford, a troubled runaway who had been in the system since the age of 12. She had a history of substance abuse and shoplifting. She had dropped out of school twice, and she was living between friends to avoid the street. It was rumored that she was a sex worker. However, Levesque was a complicated teen. Although she was regularly on the street, she did occasionally return home to her family. She had an interest in the Christian faith, although she was troubled by how God allowed his son to suffer so greatly. She removed Jesus from her crucifix and placed the small figure inside a box next to her bed. The scene of the crime had been ritualistic, and it matched rumors heard by the local detectives. The local sex workers and pimps, especially those who worked Bedford Street, had an interest in the occult and devil worship. The connections to ritualism and sex work led them to Maureen Sparta. Sparta lived in the Harbor Terrace housing projects. In her living room, she had a large satanic mural. Here, she hosted a number of devil-worshipping ceremonies, mostly during the winter months when it was too cold to gather in the Freetown State Forest. She told the detectives that goats or stray cats were occasionally sacrificed at the ceremonies. The blood would be used to baptize congregants. She said they would typically chant, invoking Satan to appear. Throughout the investigation, police frequently heard ominous references to the Freetown State Forest, a sprawling 5,000-acre reservation at the outskirts of Fall River. Known for its dense woods and isolation, the forest already had a notorious reputation. It had long been associated with violent crimes, strange occurrences, and tragic events, leading some locals to believe the land was cursed. Others described it as a hotbed of paranormal activity, a place that seemed to attract those drawn to the occult. According to several witnesses, much of the cult's activity took place deep within the forest, where torchlit ceremonies were allegedly conducted around a large flat stone slab referred to as the altar. Here, animals were reportedly sacrificed, their blood spilled as an offering to Satan. Even after the Fall River cult murders trial concluded, the Freetown State Forest continued to serve as a gathering point for those involved in dark rituals. Years later, in November 1988, a hunter stumbled across a camouflaged bunker deep within the forest. When police investigated, they found a chilling cache of items, including dolls with gouged out eyes, animal bones, a rusted butcher knife, a small wooden chair, and tattered children's clothing. That same year, a dozen mutilated calves were discovered in the forest. Though cult activity was suspected in all these cases, no conclusive evidence ever surfaced. With the history of Freetown State Forest, the detectives knew they were circling something dark, but they couldn't yet grasp just how close they were to the heart of it. Then, they were invited to attend the next ritual. Horrifyingly, they attended alongside those who would become future victims, and the very killers who would soon take their lives. While the local investigation seemed to stall on the occult within Harbor Terrace, it bizarrely developed elsewhere. In October 1979, just a few weeks after Levesque had been discovered, a man named Andy Maltese contacted Paul Fitzgerald, the veteran state detective leading the investigation. Maltese was a local offender with a fascination for the occult. Maltese told Fitzgerald that he had two friends who knew about the Levesque murder. He introduced Robin Murphy and Karen Marsden. The two were romantic partners. Murphy seemed reluctant to meet, but Marsden was anxious and desperate. Almost immediately, she named the killer, Carl Drew. Karen Marsden said she was living with her grandmother at the time, regularly visiting her son JJ, who lived with a local foster family. Marsden said a few months prior she had been living on the street, and Carl Drew was her pimp. Robin Murphy did little to corroborate Marsden's statement, even when pressed. She was reluctant to cooperate with police. Murphy said that she had formerly been on the street, but she was living in Harbor Terrace now. She had also formerly been a sex worker, but she had transitioned into pimping girls on Bedford Street, including Marsden. Fitzgerald told them he couldn't do much with what they were giving, but the two refused to give any additional information. As they parted ways, Marsden told him, "If you find me dead, Carl Drew did it." In the following weeks, Marsden left increasingly frantic messages for Fitzgerald. However, she didn't provide any additional information about the Levesque case. At the same time, Maltese continued to call him with concerns of his own, claiming his girlfriend, Barbara Raposa, had gone missing in early November. It wasn't until January that her body was found. In the late afternoon of January 26, 1980, a man training his hunting dogs in a field behind an abandoned printing factory stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. The dogs had led him to a woman's body hidden away in the cold brush near Route 24 and Jefferson Street in Fall River. Her face was unrecognizable, crushed from repeated blunt force trauma, and her body had begun to decay in the freezing winter air. The local detectives, Carrie, Sylvia, and Joaquin, identified the body by scouring through local missing persons reports. They matched the description of the clothing and determined their victim was Barbara Raposa. She had disappeared in early November, weeks after Levesque's body was discovered, and the similarities between the cases drew the attention of local and state detectives. They knew Raposa and Levesque lived at the margins of Fall River's crumbling society, working Bedford Street. They had suffered a horrendous level of violence, and it was likely that the two cases were connected. The medical examiner discovered traces of concrete powder on her skin, a partial bite mark on her chest, and indications of sexual assault. Fitzgerald knew that Maltese and Raposa had dated, but early in the investigation, he discovered that she was actually dating Dave Cowan at the time of her death. Tragically, there is little information about Raposa's personal life. She was a 19-year-old single mother with a history of drug abuse and sex work. Her father reported her missing on November 7th after she failed to pick up her son from the babysitter. She was last seen by Cowan the night of her disappearance. Local investigators were contacted by Carol Fletcher on January 30th. She said her friend had details about the Raposa murder. That friend was Karen Marsden. Fletcher arranged a surprise meeting with the local detectives, and Marsden instantly broke down crying. She said she was terrified that Carl Drew and Robin Murphy were going to kill her or her family if she gave them any information. She spoke of an afternoon months prior when she drove with Robin Murphy and Carol Fletcher deep into Freetown State Forest. Even now, this area is so undeveloped, it's bereft of cellular signal and hiking trails. They drove deep into the woods along dirt roads, following Murphy's directions. Then they stopped near a weathered structure and an altar nestled among the trees. Murphy told them that Carl Drew said he would kill Marsden and Fletcher and offer their souls to Satan at the altar. He wanted to inject battery acid into their veins and leave their bodies by the side of the road. The state and local investigators labeled Carl Drew as a person of interest. However, they had one lead they needed to follow up, a commonality connecting Levesque and Raposa. That lead was Andy Maltese. Surprisingly, on February 5th, Maltese contacted Fitzgerald and told him that he had a prophetic dream and knew what had happened to Raposa. He told the investigators that he had been up in a tree looking down at the scene, watching a tall man with long hair beat a woman. He saw that man was wielding a heavy piece of concrete or rock in his hands. He described the man striking the woman as she laid on her back. With each blow, her legs jerked off the ground. He told the police that he wanted to help, but he was unable to. He said that Raposa called out to him, asking for his help, asking for his forgiveness. They took Maltese to the scene of the crime, and he correctly located where the body was and how it was positioned. He recited details that had not been made publicly available, all under the guise of a psychic revelation. On February 7, 1980, Andy Maltese was arrested for the murder of Barbara Raposa. The next day, Detective Sylvia met with Karen Marsden, hoping to get more information about Carl Drew or Robin Murphy. They drove around Fall River, and Marsden repeated again that she believed she was going to die. They dropped her off at St. Mary's Cathedral. It was the last time that she was seen alive. On February 9th, Robin Murphy told detectives that she had been present when Andy Maltese murdered Barbara Raposa. She said they had been in a vehicle with Maltese on November 7th, 1979. She said that Maltese had threatened to kill Raposa due to her relationship with David Cowan. The two picked up Raposa from a local diner, and she alleged that Raposa and her had an argument that escalated into a physical fight in the backseat of the car. Murphy admitted she had bit Raposa during the altercation. According to Murphy, the car stopped on a remote stretch near Jefferson Street. Maltese forcibly removed Barbara from the vehicle while Murphy remained inside. She claimed to listen to the radio while Maltese and Raposa had sat in the woods. She said it appeared as though Raposa was tied up, and at one point, Maltese came back to the vehicle to retrieve paraphernalia. Then Murphy claimed she saw Maltese physically attack Barbara with a large rock or piece of concrete, delivering repeated blows to her head and body as she lay on the ground. Robin stated that she stayed in the car, listening to the radio, while the attack unfolded just a few feet away. The detailed testimony provided investigators with a temporary sense of clarity, but there was still something unsettling beneath the surface. Murphy's account, while vivid, raised as many questions as it answered. Her knowledge of the crime scene was almost too precise, and her apparent detachment from the violence she described left detectives uneasy. The following day, Karen Marsden's grandmother called the station to report her missing. She gave the police a name to follow up on: Carl Drew. Following Marsden's disappearance, investigators turned their attention back to Carl Drew and Robin Murphy. Drew, already a suspect in the murder of Doreen Levesque, was interrogated on February 10, 1980. He recalled seeing Marsden in a vehicle with Carol Fletcher and Robin Murphy. He denied any involvement in Marsden's disappearance, offering a vague alibi that placed him at local bars on Bedford Street the night she vanished. Detectives were unconvinced. They believed he was hiding something, but they had no evidence to hold him. Meanwhile, Robin Murphy's role became even murkier. Her connections to Drew and her shifting testimonies about the murders of Levesque and Raposa placed her at the center of the growing web of suspicion. Her initial silence added to the detectives' growing unease about her potential involvement. As the days turned into weeks, the hope of finding Marsden alive dwindled. As detectives dug deeper into Fall River's underbelly, the shadow of Carl Drew loomed larger, his influence entwined with every dark corner of the case. His influence extended beyond threats of physical violence. He cultivated an atmosphere of paranoia, fostering the belief that he had a direct connection to dark forces capable of wreaking havoc on anyone who crossed him. Among those who didn't believe in the occult, Drew's brutality was legendary. Rumors swirled that he regularly beat his followers for even the most minor of infractions. The pervasive fear cultivated by Carl Drew hampered the investigation, and detectives were at a standstill. But on April 13, 1980, that all changed. While clearing brush on his property, a local man stumbled upon a partial human skull, its jawbone missing. Nearby investigators recovered jewelry, a high-heeled shoe, blue jeans, and tatters of a woman's sweater. They discovered clumps of human hair and scalp, as well as the carcasses of 3 cats. The partial remains were taken to Dr. Ambrose Keeley, the medical examiner. The skull had no teeth, and it had suffered skeletal fractures from blunt force trauma. Using x-rays of her skull taken 6 months earlier, they identified the remains as belonging to Marsden. Both exemplars showcased the same bone patterns, which are as unique as fingerprints. Shortly afterward, Maureen Sparta told police that Robin Murphy had confessed to killing Karen Marsden. According to Sparta, Murphy claimed she strangled Marsden with her bare hands and suggested it would take years for the police to uncover what really happened. Later, during a wiretapped phone call, Murphy confessed again, this time claiming she murdered Marsden out of love for Sparta. Carol Fletcher corroborated parts of this story. She told investigators that she had driven Carl Drew, Carl Davis, and Robin Murphy to Westport, where Murphy and Drew ultimately killed Marsden. An arrest warrant was issued for Robin Murphy, and when she was apprehended, she told police that Marsden had become a liability. Marsden had witnessed Levesque's murder, and her continuous contact with the police meant it was only a matter of time before they would all end up behind bars. The following testimony is graphic. According to Murphy, Carl Drew forced her to drag Marsden from the car by her hair. What followed was a brutal ritual. Drew, Murphy, Davis, and Fletcher stoned Marsden as an act of shame and punishment, just as they had with Doreen Levesque. Drew then stripped Marsden of her jewelry, and when her ring wouldn't come off, he severed her finger. Murphy claimed that Drew snapped Marsden's neck with his bare hands before ordering her to slit Marsden's throat. Afterward, Drew and Davis decapitated her and kicked her severed head around the woods. In their final acts of desecration, Drew carved an X on the body and began speaking in tongues. He claimed he was offering Marsden's soul to Satan. He marked Murphy with the blood from the body. Then Murphy claimed she was forced to perform indecent acts with the corpse before it was dumped in the woods, soaked with gasoline, and burned. Marsden's brutal murder was a dark chapter in an already haunting investigation. It began with the grisly murder of Doreen Levesque, whose body was discovered beneath the steel bleachers of a local high school. Then came Barbara Raposa, her remains found in a desolate field near an abandoned printing factory. And finally, Karen Marsden. She had come forward with information about Carl Drew, Robin Murphy, and the occult sacrifices to something dark and malevolent. She begged for protection from the police, but in the end, found none. When Karen Marsden vanished, the darkness in the underbelly of Fall River began to bleed into the open, pulling with it a sinister cast. Carl Drew, Robin Murphy, Carl Davis, and Andy Maltese. The grim narrative of manipulation, violence, and occult ritual had become testimony, recorded in transcripts and presented as evidence. But this wasn't a simple case of crime and punishment. It was something far more disturbing. Andy Maltese was the first to stand trial in January 1981. The prosecution presented his psychic dream to the jury, underscoring that he knew specific details about the crime scene and body location that were not made publicly available. They presented a transcript of a conversation Maltese had with the district attorney's office, where he told an interviewer that he used to hide behind a stone wall near Raposa's Fall River apartment to watch her and David Cowan. He was upset that they were no longer together, and he claimed he was only thinking of their son. However, the testimony from Robin Murphy was the most damning. She testified that she waited in the vehicle, listening to the radio, and she witnessed Maltese bind, assault, and murder Barbara Raposa. In January 1981, Andy Maltese was convicted of the first-degree murder of Barbara Raposa and given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Strangely, before his lawyer left the courtroom, a reporter for the New Bedford-Stanford Times approached him with several logistical questions. Robin Murphy claims that she was waiting in the vehicle and listening to the radio, which means the keys were inside the vehicle. So how could Maltese have opened the trunk to retrieve paraphernalia without the keys in his hand? Some claim that Maltese was suspected in several other sex crimes that predated Raposa. However, there were no publicly released details that confirmed this suspicion. Andy Maltese died of cancer in 1998. The trial of Carl Drew shortly followed. Murphy's testimony was a centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She recited what she told detectives about the satanic ritual in Freetown State Forest, where Drew forced her to participate in the murder of Karen Marsden. The defense attorney challenged Murphy's credibility, pointing to her immunity deal and prior inconsistencies in her statements. He argued that she was motivated by self-preservation and blamed Drew to avoid culpability. The defense called Margarita Reverito, who provided an alibi for Drew the night of Marsden's murder. Later, the defense attorney tried to strengthen this alibi by stating Drew might have attended a wedding around the same time. Ultimately, the jury found Carl Drew guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sadly, the murder of Doreen Levesque was never prosecuted, as the district attorney believed that justice had been served. Drew was already serving a life sentence. Robin Murphy stood trial, charged with second-degree murder in connection with the death of Karen Marsden. Murphy faced accusations that she had actively participated in the ritualistic killing. Though she claimed that Drew had forced her to take part, the prosecution argued that Murphy's involvement went beyond mere coercion, portraying her as a willing participant. The defense portrayed Murphy as a vulnerable young woman under the control of a manipulative and violent man. They highlighted that Murphy had suffered extreme sexual abuse since childhood, and she had been on the street since the age of 11. In the end, Murphy was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. However, the story didn't end with the Fall River satanic cult behind bars. Over the years, new twists emerged. Although his sentencing had been finalized, Carl Drew was beginning a new battle, one to clear his name. From the moment of his arrest, Drew maintained his innocence. He denied any involvement in Marsden's murder and rejected claims that he led a satanic cult. From the outset, he claimed that the testimonies used against him, particularly Robin Murphy's, were fabricated and coerced. Over the years, he filed multiple appeals that were repeatedly denied, so he began to reach out to journalists and legal advocates, seeking public attention for what he described as a miscarriage of justice. Although Robin Murphy initially cooperated with the prosecution and played a key role in Carl Drew's conviction, her credibility came under scrutiny in the years that followed. Early in the investigation, Murphy struck a plea deal to testify against Drew and other suspects, which allowed her to plead guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree murder in exchange for immunity in the murders of Doreen Levesque and Barbara Raposa. Despite the initial impact of her testimony, Murphy's story began to change, and it would continue to change in the years following the trial. Carl Davis, who had also been indicted for Karen Marsden's murder, never stood trial after Murphy recanted key parts of her testimony. Yet Davis's connection to the case didn't end there. A year later, in January 1982, Carl Davis was arrested and charged with assault after attacking Maureen Sparta in the Harbor Terrace housing project. Sparta was 3 months pregnant at the time. According to reports, Davis violently assaulted her, leaving her with multiple lacerations, and he stabbed a man who tried to intervene. Many speculated that this attack was an attempt for intimidation or retribution over the Fall River cult murders. Then in the mid-1980s, Murphy recanted significant portions of her earlier testimony, claiming that she had fabricated parts of her story under pressure from investigators and prosecutors. She alleged that law enforcement had coerced her into implicating Drew, and that her testimony had been molded to fit the narrative of a satanic cult. Murphy's recantation caused a stir, leading to renewed scrutiny of the case. Drew's defense team argued that her shifting story cast doubt on the integrity of the original trial. Despite these efforts, Drew's conviction was upheld as the court deemed Murphy's recantation unreliable. The prosecution maintained that her initial testimony was credible and that her later changes were an attempt to manipulate the system. Murphy became eligible for parole in 1996, but her path to release was fraught with complications. Over the years, she continued to change her story, further recanting parts of her testimony and insisting that Drew was not the mastermind behind the murders. In 2004, after serving over 20 years in prison, Murphy was granted parole and released to a long-term treatment facility. Within 7 years, she violated the conditions of her parole by engaging in a relationship with a convicted felon and allegedly being present during a drug deal. As a result, she was returned to prison. In 2024, Murphy once again made headlines when she provided a new account of the events surrounding the murder. She claimed there was no satanic cult, and that the idea of such a cult had been suggested by law enforcement. According to Murphy, the Fall River police had created the satanic cult narrative to intimidate local sex workers, and she had played along out of fear and self-preservation. She pointed to Drew and other pimps in the area as rivals in a turf war over control of the Bedford Street prostitution ring. Robin Murphy received parole for the second time on May 13th, 2024. Throughout the years, Murphy's credibility has been a point of contention. Some view her as a manipulative figure who changed her story to suit her needs, while others believe she was a young woman caught in a web of fear, coercion, and violence. Her repeated recantations and shifting narratives have left many wondering whether justice was truly served in the Fall River cult murders. Despite Murphy's later claims, other witnesses from the original investigation, such as Carol Fletcher, continued to assert that Murphy had been a key participant in the murders. Fletcher herself alleged that she had been threatened by Murphy and pressured by law enforcement to testify against Drew. According to Fletcher's revised version of events, it was Murphy, not Drew, who had killed Marsden, dismembered the body, and disposed of it in various locations. The Fall River cult murders were more than just a series of brutal killings. they unearthed something deeply unsettling, an underworld of fear, control, and ritual. Yet what's most disturbing is the possibility that this cult wasn't confined to Fall River alone. Some believe it was part of a broader network stretching across southern Massachusetts. Even the Freetown State Forest became a breeding ground for dark rituals and death. Over the years, it's been the site of unexplained animal mutilations, bizarre crimes, and whispers of occult gatherings. Some say the land itself is cursed, that whatever was awakened there never truly left. The fear of what might still be lurking in those woods remains. There are those who claim the darkness didn't die. It only moved, spreading its reach through the interstate via the New Bedford Highway Killer, where women continued to disappear without a trace. The fear is that there were more victims, more lives lost, and more horrors hidden in the shadows, never fully uncovered. The Fall River murders may have ended with arrests and convictions, but for those living closest to that darkness, the nightmare may never have truly ended, because sometimes the end of one nightmare is only the beginning of another.